well. In her view, these facts are given, they're beyond her will, and as such cannot be denied. But neither can they form the basis for any political action or self-reflection, because what is given is presumed to remain completely excluded from what is made. She does not understand the remaking of the given to rectify the ineffective rhetoric of human rights by laying out the conditions under which political rhetoric can become and remain effective. Indeed, she criticizes most of the international treaties of the day as being powerless and useless. Freedom does not come from me or from you. That human being is a function or effect of this egalitarianism. Indeed, if there is no equality, there is no. Indeed, most of the key political principles that Arendt elaborates are brought into being through the space of appearance, and this space is brought into funding for public education and to oppose budget cuts and fee hikes. But with neoliberal standards that would allocate money to institutions and objected to the new neoliberal standards that would allocate money to institutions on the basis of quantifiable measures of excellence. These are demonstrations that if they are transported in one way through digital media, they are surely left in place in the economic sense, holding the camera or the cell phone face to face with those that oppose, unprotected, injurable, perhaps injured, yet persistent, if not insurgent. We might say that we should be talking about events and not actions. I know there are several French philosophers who do that. But what do we miss if we agree to that substitute? That we have to accept that what bodies are doing on the street, when they are demonstrating, is linked fundamentally to what communication devices and technologies are doing when they report on what is happening in the street. The one exercise of freedom is now linked to the other exercise, which means that both are ways of exercising rights and that together they bring about a space of appearance. Although some may wager that the exercise of rights now takes place quite at the expense of bodies on the street, that Twitter and other virtual technologies have led to a disembodiment of the public sphere, I wish to disagree. The media requires those bodies on the street to have an event, even as the street requires media to exist in a global arena and even to be localized. Under what conditions then? When those cameras, under conditions rather, when those with cameras or internet capacities are imprisoned or tortured or deported, then the use of the technology effectively implicates the body. Not only must someone's hand tap and send, but someone's body is on the line if that tapping and sending gets traced. In other words, localization is hardly overcome through the use of the media that potentially transmits globally. And if this conjuncture of street and media constitutes a very contemporary version of the public sphere or indeed the political sphere, then bodies on the line have to be thought as both there and here, now and then, transported and stationary, with very different political consequences following from those two modalities of space and time. In fact, given the way that global media is distributed differentially across the globe, we are actually talking about a multiplication of temporal and spatial conjunctions. It matters that it is public squares that are filled to the rim, that people need to sleep there, sitting and refuse to seek that space, as we saw in Cairo. And I would add here that it matters that Gaddafi closed the public square as his first way of responding to the demonstrations. I also have some question of who is legally able to demonstrate in Santiago. but we'll talk about that in a moment. It matters that it's public educational buildings that have been seized in Athens, London, and Berkeley. At Berkeley, buildings were seized and trespassing fines were handed out, and in some cases, students were accused of destroying private property. But these very allegations raise the question of whether the university is public or private. I don't want to debate the pros and cons of this particular action, but I do recognize that the stated aim of the protest to seize the building and to suppress and for students to sequester themselves there was a way to gain a platform, indeed a way to secure the material conditions for appearing in public. Such actions generally do not take place when effective platforms are already available. The students there, but also at Goldsmiths College in the UK more recently, were seizing buildings as a way to lay claim to buildings that ought properly now and in the future to belong to public education. That doesn't mean that every time these buildings are seized, it is okay, but let us be alert to what is at stake here. The symbolic meaning of seizing these buildings is that these buildings belong to the public education, and it's precisely the access to public education which is being undermined by fee and tuition hikes and budget cuts. We should not then be surprised that these protests took the form of seizing buildings, performatively laying claim to public education, performatively gaining literal access to the buildings of public education precisely at a moment historically when that access is being shut down. According to Arendt, even when we are able to make law or change law, it's precisely because we have taken it upon ourselves to exercise rights we have not been granted, and so to grant them to ourselves prior to anyone granting them to us. This is a kind of anarchist moment, that she would reject it, but I think it's there. We make the demand that the law register and enforce such rights, but when we do that, we are acting politically to change the legal registers of our lives. We are not collapsing politics into legal reform, but we're making use of the law as one political instrument among others. I want to argue that it's on the basis of relatively non-unified alliances that such claims are made, and that it's only on the condition that alliances resist the demands of internal conformity that they can exercise their demands with transformative political effects. Although Arendt sometimes makes this upsurge of freedom appear to be radically unconditioned, we have to assume that when and where radical demands for change emerge within a public domain that has been censored, or where such claims have been punished, they are drawn from a myriad of local and global cultural and political resources. So the exercise of freedom takes place through particular languages and conventions, through forms of borrowing and translation, through historical conditions and lexicons that appear precisely as resources at a moment of crisis. In this sense, our expression of freedom needs to be revised in order to give a fuller account of the cultural and political means through which the exercise of freedom takes place, and how those means actively and substantially contribute to the version of freedom at stake. Moreover, as we think about the forms of plurality that make those very claims of freedom at the present time, we have to think more concretely about modes of alliance that exceed both liberal and humanitarian paradigms. Let me offer you two anecdotes to make my points more concrete. Last year, I was asked to visit Turkey on the occasion of the International Conference Against Homophobia and Transphobia. This was an especially important event in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, where transgender people are often served fines for appearing in public, are often beaten, sometimes by the police, and where murders of transgender women in particular happen nearly once a month in recent years. I understand that if you are gender non-normative or transgender in Santiago, you also can be fined by appearing in public. I understand as well that if you are gender non-normative or transgender in Santiago, you run the risk of losing your job. Okay, so we're not talking about anything that's very awesome. If I offer you this example of Turkey, it's not to point out that Turkey is behind or slow, something that the embassy representative from Denmark was quick to point out to me, and which I refuse with equal speed. I assure you that there are equally brutal murders outside of Los Angeles and Detroit, in Wyoming and Louisiana, or even in New York, for brutal acts against transgender people in Penn Station in New York City. It is rather because what was astonishing about the alliances there is that several feminist organizations have worked with queer, gay, lesbian, and transgender people against police violence, but also against militarism, against nationalism, against the forms of masculinism by which they are supported, right? Including state violence against the Kurds. So on the street after the conference, the feminists lined up with the drag queens, the genderqueer with the human rights activists, and the lipstick lesbians with their bisexual and heterosexual friends, and the march included secularists and Muslims both. They chanted, "We will not be soldiers, and we will not kill." To oppose the police violence against trans people is thus to be openly against military violence and the nationalist escalation of militarism. It is also to be against the military aggression against the Kurds and to act in the memory of the Armenian genocide, and against modes of disavowal on the part of states that continue their violence in other ways. So it's an example of alliance, by appearing in public across different genders. It was with some amazement that I found myself only days later in Lyon, France. I'm not always traveling like this. As part of a conference on gender and education, and there one of the established feminists had written a book on the illusion of transsexuality. The illusion of transsexuality. And her public lectures had been zapped by many trans activists and their queer allies. She defended herself by saying that to call transsexuality psychotic or an illusion was not the same as pathologizing transsexuality. It is, she said, a descriptive term and makes no judgment or prescription. Under what conditions can calling a population psychotic for the particular embodied life they live not be pathologizing? This feminist calls herself a materializing of freedom, but let me be clear about what this means. I do not mean to say that everything that constitutes gender is freely chosen. What I do mean to say is that even what seems to us to be unfree, unchosen, can and must be claimed and exercised in some way in the public sphere.